Am overwhelmed by that canned applause. I really don't know what to say. A lot of people wouldn't drink it in the way I do, but I drink every drop. You know, somebody else who was canceled when the station went down was a great mind, a great political historian, a great speaker, but he's lived on, just as have we. He has his own podcast around the political world with John Rothman. He is a regular visitor on Wednesdays. John Rothman. Hi, John Rothman.
Good morning. I have to tell you, I listened to the Yellow Jacket story years ago. I was sliding on sand, on cardboard, and went over a Yellow Jacket nest. I want you to know, you talk about puns. It was a real stinger.
Oh, that is
just terrible. So people should be aware.
People should be aware of both the Yellow Jackets and the puns that await.
My words upset so many people.
So, John Rothman.
Yes,
please.
Come in on Hawaii. My niece and her husband have a condo, which was devastated in the fire. My brother called me this morning to tell me. They're fine because they're here and they have another house in Hawaii, so they're all right. But the destruction is overwhelming. And Kim, I immediately thought of you, knowing your Hawaii connection. And this is just a disaster. And I on the podcast this morning, I talked about the fact that we now have a situation in Hawaii, but we also have a situation in the United States. We have a situation in Europe. We have a situation in China of these extreme weather moments and the impact, which is profound. And I hope people understand that the issue of global warming is a real issue and one which needs to be understood in the context of what's happening in our world, not tomorrow, but today.
Well, I mean, in truth, decades ago, the warnings are decades old. This is exactly what the experts said would happen. I mean, this is a globe burning up, and there's a recession in sea ice. There is, as you suggested, this series of conflagrations across Asia, across Europe, in Hawaii, and in this country. Professor Rothman, indeed. Somebody said they started listening to your podcast because of this show, around the political world because of this show.
It's a wide range, and I'm very grateful for the fact that, and by the way, people can hear you and me because we send this, Albert sends this to my producer who downloads it and puts it up on the weekend.
Yeah, very, very cool. And it's our pleasure to, to spread the word. You're, I think, a great voice for so many different issues. So I do want to, as we step from the world of environment and what's happening with the globe, let's talk about politics, John Rothman. That's really your world. I mentioned before what's happening, and I think it's a real reminder of the power of the vote in Ohio, where they beat back a GOP, I feel, underhanded kind of, it was a referendum that was really snuck on to the summer schedule, which, as you know, is just a time when there's depressed voter turnout.
It was the only issue on the ballot. It was designed so that the constitutional amendment, which now requires 50% plus one, to be raised to 60%. And the reason they were doing this is because there will be on the ballot in November a measure dealing with the question of abortion in Ohio. And the Republicans, thinking there would be a lower voter turnout, thinking that people wouldn't pay attention, tried to put this over on the people of Ohio. And the most incredible thing was their response. And I have to tell you, if you listen to my podcast yesterday, I predicted this would happen. There was and will be a continuing backlash, not only in a state like Ohio, but in Kansas, for instance, where women understand the issue is not abortion. The issue is a woman's right to choose, a woman's right to control her own body. And I think the Republicans are on the wrong side of this, and I think they're going to pay a consequence at the polls, and I certainly hope they do.
There's no question they're on the wrong side of it. The question becomes your second point, which is, to what extent might they pay a price at the polls?
Well, certainly in control of the House. I think this is going to be a major issue. I think it's going to be a major issue in terms of the United States Senate. And I think in the presidential race, it's going to be a critical factor because people understand that if you have a Mike Pence as president, or a Donald Trump as president, or a Ron DeSantis as president, that there will be more restrictions attempted and imposed on women around this country. And so there has to be a backlash. There is a backlash, and may I say, a well-deserved backlash.
The number of openings, if you will, of open seats that will present themselves in the next election, does the Democratic Party have a chance, or do the number of open seats and the way they're opening in some of these districts, you mentioned the House, the heavily gerrymandered House races, does that favor the GOP in some way?
No, I think it favors the Democrats, and I'll tell you why. The Republicans now have a 4-vote lead in the House. That will be easily decimated. I really believe that, because it's not just the question of the Republican Party, it's what they claim to stand for. So what you're going to see in the Midwest is a reaction on Ukraine, because Republican candidates for president tend to be more isolationist. And remember, you have a large Eastern European community that exists in the Middle West. They're not going to vote for the Republicans on this. Women and people who believe in women's reproductive rights are not going to stand for this. And I think the Republicans are beginning to understand it. But here's the problem. They can't afford, that is, the Republican Party itself feels it can't afford to alienate its base. And the base may get Donald Trump the nomination for president, but it's not going to get him elected president of the United States. But that applies to all Republicans. And so I say this with some regret. Once upon a time, the Republican Party was the party that advocated for the Equal Rights Amendment, that advocated for women's rights. And they have completely isolated themselves. And may I just quickly say, it isn't just women, Mark. It's men like me who believe strongly that women should control their own bodies. If somebody tried to control my body, trust me, they'd have a fight on their hands. So I think that's what's happening. May I just quickly throw in, you mentioned the question of Donald Trump this morning. The New York Times has a cover story this morning that is quite remarkable. It turns out that one of the unindicted co-conspirators, who may well be indicted, prepared a memo in advance of the election outlining how the Republicans could throw up roadblocks to a Biden victory. Now, he put all kinds of escape clauses in the memo saying, well, it may not be right, there may be contests about it, but it will put the focus on, I'm telling you, this is an incriminating memo. And I have to remember that it was exactly 49 years ago today that Richard Nixon left the presidency of the United States. August 9th was when the resignation became effective. And remember that the question of obstruction of justice was one of the critical issues. And the idea that Donald Trump did, in fact, obstruct justice is reinforced by this memo. Certainly his lawyers were completely aware of it. Certainly John Eastman was completely aware of it. And I believe this will have an impact as well.
I think the obstruction of justice on any number of issues, you're talking about essentially J6, or you're talking about the effort to overthrow
that's the beauty of this. It is not January 6th. It's what happened before.
No, I was just about to say it's
the attempt to legally obstruct an American presidential election.
Right.
It is, in my judgment, sedition, although that word is not used in the indictment. But
because that's a squishy word, that's the reason they avoided it in the indictment. Yeah. But the reality is, John, that you're right. And that memo actually specified, the memo to which you've referred, actually, which is just revealed in these New York Times pieces, they specifically know that this will likely be overturned at the Supreme Court level. Those words are there. This will likely be overturned at the Supreme Court, but they suggest this will buy us more time to pursue our court cases and sow more doubt about the legitimacy of the election. That was their plan.
I think it is a nail in the coffin of the defenders of Donald Trump. By the way, are you following what his lawyers are saying? His lawyers can't agree on a strategy. Trump is contradicting his lawyers. And may I tell you that Donald Trump's language last night in his rally was absolutely appalling, and the accusations he's making are ridiculous. But let me put it in a bottom line. Donald Trump may well be the Republican nominee for president. I think it's very logical that he could be, even if he's indicted. As I've pointed out before, even if he were indicted and convicted, he could run for president, as Eugene V. Debs did in 1920, as the socialist candidate for president, and received almost 1 million votes in that campaign. But the Republican Party has to wake up. They have to understand what Donald Trump is doing to the Republican Party. And I've said it before on this program, and I'll say it again. Donald Trump Jr. on the Ellipse on January 6th said, it is no longer the Republican Party. It is the party of Trump. And if that's the case, we are in deep trouble because we need a vital, vibrant two-party system. So I think that the next thing you and I are going to be looking at, I hope by next Wednesday, will be the indictment from Georgia, which is going to be quite a remarkable document.
And those it was pertaining to that the Trump remarks that you were shaming essentially just a moment ago. I think those are the remarks that you're talking about, right? He went after the attorney general there in Georgia. Yes,
the district attorney.
District attorney. Sorry, yeah, district attorney.
And she's a black woman, and he's going after her with all of the innuendo and connotation that involves. But let me assure everyone that indictment is going to be airtight as well. And so these are going to be issues we're going to be debating. Could Donald Trump, in the midst of 4 major indictments, be nominated by the Republican Party? Well, just remember, the Republicans now have a new rule. Winner take all. So if you win a majority of the votes in a primary or a caucus, you get those delegates. And it is going to be a remarkable moment. I think we are just getting ready. But let me also point out to you that there are some running for the Republican nomination, including DeSantis, who said they would pardon Donald Trump. Let me be clear. A president can be pardoned on federal charges. He could be, but not on state charges. So one way or the other, the noose is tightening on Donald Trump. And I don't say that with any joy. I'm not happy that we have had a president of the United States who has brought such dishonor to our country and to the electoral process.
It's interesting, John, the more you speak and the more you speak about the legal walls closing in, the more I come to, and this is a reiteration for people who watch this show regularly, because I've made this point before, his only escape hatch is winning the presidency.
Yes.
So it's really all about politics now and not about law. So his lawyers disagree. They're delaying what legal strategy he's going to pursue. Doesn't matter in a way. It is going to come down to the election. Now, if he doesn't win the presidential election, that I think is an interesting hypothetical, John. And we've touched on it before, and we'll touch on it again, because I think the institutions of Washington, many of which you refer to along the way here, because you're such a great historian on political stuff and on Washington stuff, I think those institutions may protect him, just for the reasons you said. They can't bear to see a U.S. president, shamed in this way.
Let me offer this. I worked for Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was, there's a new book coming out about Richard Nixon, and the only blurb on the book is my blurb. I didn't write the book, but it's a brilliant book by Paul Carter. Richard Nixon, the Republican Party owed him up the kazoo. They didn't stick with him when the truth was out. Some of his constituents, some of the people who believed in him did. But I really believe in the fundamental integrity of the American people, just like I believe in the voters in Ohio. The voters
John,
in
they
Ohio
pardoned him. They pardoned him. How can you say they didn't stand by him? Jerry Ford pardoned him.
No, yes, but Richard Nixon, and I urge people to listen to the David Frost interview with Richard Nixon, in which he says, I impeached myself. I gave them the sword and they thrust it into me. And we now know, when you talk about Richard Nixon objectively, there were things he did in his presidency which were very positive. Very good. The war on cancer, the opening to China, détente with Russia. You can go down the list. There were a lot of things he did that were wrong. No question about it. The same kind of evaluation has to be given to Donald Trump. There were things which he did which some will consider to be positive, and he deserves credit for those, as any president does. But his desecration of the Constitution, his contempt for the Constitution, his contempt for his oath of office, rings through every news story coming out. And I have to do something, Mark. That's a terrible thing maybe to say, but I really believe it. I have to have faith in the American people. I know the American people make mistakes. I know we've blown a lot of things in history, and we could go a whole recitation of all the things we've done wrong. But fundamentally, I believe the American people will get it. And because Smith's indictment is so clear, so precise, so ambiguous, you will note that none of Trump's lawyers have said the charges aren't true. They're saying that what he's doing is going after Trump on free speech. Nonsense, rubbish. And we need to make sure that people understand what the actual charges are. Remember, what caught Richard Nixon, with all of his denials and all that, was one tape, June 23rd, where he and Bob Haldeman conspired to have the FBI and the CIA cover up Watergate. And that was what did it. And the Republican Party and the people of America had the good sense to understand it. And we had better do the same thing with Donald Trump. I know it's almost redundant, and I have to think very carefully when I do my podcast. How often can I talk about Donald Trump? Well, let me tell you, we're in a battle for the soul of American democracy, and there can be a relentless endeavor to expose what this man has done and continues to do. That's the end of my sermon, Mark, but I wanted to make it clear.
I'll ding desecration, and I will ding a recitation. Very, very strong offering from Brother Rothmann. Well, you know, I don't have the faith that you do in the American people, and I don't have the faith that you do in the American institutions. In fact, I think they are poorly constructed for today's America. I think the system is easily gamed. It's being easily gamed every hour on Capitol Hill with a Senate which provides us in California the same crappy representation that they get in North Dakota, South Dakota. They've gamed the Senate so we don't even have a legitimate shot at the people's voice being reflected there.
You know what the founders said about that? The founders said it was like a cup of tea, and that the saucer cooled the beverage, which is what allowed for the American system to work. So I'm going to make a deal with you, because you and I are going to be doing this for many, many years to come, Mark.
All right.
Let's see what happens. Whether my faith is sustained or your faith is upheld, let's see. We'll find out.
Look, on the Trump thing, I would say if the election's held today, or if it is indeed Biden versus Trump, I would think Biden should beat him. But that's
overwhelmingly.
That's not the point I'm trying to make. I'm trying to make a point about the institutions of America and how this American, and a great love for this country, feels as though there are flaws. We need to open up the hood on a few things. I mean, the Supreme. Yeah, well, of course, there have always been flaws.
We could do a historical retrospective on the United States of America and point out all of the flaws. But the bottom line must be, for your safety and my safety and the safety of all of those listening to this broadcast, we have to believe that in the end, even if we make mistakes, America tries to do the right thing. I realize the imperfections in the system, but Donald Trump is not going to escape justice, just as Richard Nixon did not escape justice. And I think that is the key to the faith that I have in American democracy.
Yeah, and there you go. You got Kevin saying, "Sorry, Mark. Recent elections say otherwise." I'm not saying that the elections can't be won by the Democrats or even won by the righteous. I mean, that is to say, the more righteous causes. We just saw it in Ohio. I talked about that. And at some point, they push so far in this lunacy that they pursue that you'd think that the people do bite back. But what I am talking about is the institutions of government that have been seized, for example, by the Supreme Court. You now have legislation from the bench. The reason for that is that Congress has ground to a halt. This hyper-partisan environment in Washington has forced Congress into this stalemate. And so the Supreme Court swoops in and they do it all.
Let me just remind you, the same argument about legislation from the bench was used against the Supreme Court in Brown versus the Board of Education. These are recurring political arguments which take place. But let me point out to you what the Chief Justice of the United States did on this ghost gun provision in a stunning reversal of what many people thought would be a clear victory for gun rights. The Supreme Court put a hold on that, upheld the Biden administration. No, I understand the imperfections. Look at Roe v. Wade, for God's sake, being overturned. But then I look at Ohio, and if you believe in the expression, the people shall rule, in the end, I believe everything will sort itself out. We may have a lot of things to talk about, but
yeah, and we will. And I don't mean to try to get the last word at all, John. I have immense respect for your opinion.
It's your show.
But what I would say, but what I would say just about that point about Ohio is, Ohio and that vote, you can be encouraged by it, but it wouldn't have been necessary had the Supreme Court not been jacked by Mitch McConnell and the Republicans, and this court would not have this supermajority, John.
You're right. And I wouldn't be having chocolate cake for lunch if it weren't for my diet. I mean, come on.
Okay, so that's the way it was. All right. He's John Rothmann. The podcast is Around the Political World with John Rothmann. We love him. Our former colleague from KGO. We continue on. And one of my favorite things is going round and around with Rothmann.
And we'll do it again next Wednesday, and I look forward. Who knows what may happen by Wednesday?
John Rothmann, everybody. How about it for him? Yeah, right on, John. Bye-bye. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.